Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the Bronze Age collapse, how civilization almost ended. In this journey you'll see how dazzling international trade stitched empires together, how palaces tried to manage entire economies from a handful of storerooms, how a single metal input could tilt the balance of power, and how small shocks spiraled when decision-makers misread the signals. By the end, you'll have a clearer sense of why complex societies can fail quietly for years, and then all at once. Now, before any fall, there's always a peak. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean around the years 1500 to 1250 before the Common Era. The map is crowded with heavy hitters: the Egyptian New Kingdom along the Nile, the Hittite realm across Anatolia, Mycenaean palaces sprinkled through the Aegean, Cyprus, known to scribes as Alatia, and a chain of Levantine port cities that thrive on exchange. This is not a world of isolated kingdoms. It is an early, very busy web. How did it work? Copper from Cyprus moves by ship, timber comes down from the highlands, grain flows out when harvests are good, fine textiles and crafted goods pass through port after port. Courtiers send letters and gifts across borders. Princes marry princesses precisely to keep those routes open. Treaties standardize expectations the way a customs union or a mutual defense pact might today. When a convoy leaves port, it's not just merchandise in the hold. It's a promise that tomorrow's army can be equipped, tomorrow's workshop can keep the furnaces hot, and tomorrow's elite can continue signaling status with rare goods. Here is the key dynamic for this slide: scale and interdependence. When things go right, everyone benefits. A palace that secures copper and timber can feed an army of smiths, and those smiths feed an army of soldiers. A port that guarantees safe passage earns fees and prestige. But the same interdependence that lowers costs also stretches the system thin. Long routes cross many jurisdictions. One delayed convoy, one closed strait, one frontier dispute, and the effects ripple outward. You can almost hear the question a scribe would have asked: do we have enough in the storerooms to bridge the delay, or are we counting on ships we have not yet seen? Another feature of this world is that wealth is often stored in palace-controlled goods rather than in private coin, because coinage doesn't exist yet. That means elites knit together not only by marriage, but by access to distribution. If you are in favor, you receive fine metals, textiles, and animals. If you fall out of favor, your income can evaporate. That structure binds the elite class together across courts, but it also centralizes risks. When the palace system hiccups, everyone who relies on it feels the cough. So as we set the stage, notice the two halves of the story forming. On one side, extraordinary coordination, treaties, marriage alliances, and predictable trade lanes that make this one of the most connected eras the region had ever seen. On the other side, vulnerability hiding inside that very success. When information about shortages moves slowly, when routes are long and guarded at high cost, and when your stockpiles double as your social contracts, small disturbances can become large problems. Keep that picture in mind. The system is impressive. It is also tightly coupled. And tightly coupled systems, as engineers like to say, leave very little room for error. If you remember one line from this opening, make it this: prosperity here is real and widespread, but it is balanced on corridors of exchange and decisions made in a handful of palaces. The stronger the web, the more graceful the dance, until one dancer trips. Imagine walking into a palace complex at the height of harvest season. You don't hear coins clinking, you hear scribes reciting tallies. Barley in, olive oil in, wool in, bronze fittings out. This is a command center, not a marketplace. The palace collects taxes in kind, stores them in vast magazines, and then redistributes rations to everyone from shepherds and rowers to specialist artisans and soldiers. Think of it as a logistics machine with stone walls and clay archives. How does an economy like this breathe? Through tablets and quotas. Scribes using Linear B in the Aegean or Akkadian farther east record the obligations of villages, workshops, and estates. The palace sets targets: this many hides, that many jars, this much bronze to be cast. If the numbers add up on clay, the system seems healthy. But numbers can flatter. A neat column of figures doesn't plow a field, and a ration of grain on a tablet does not feed an army unless it actually moves from storeroom to mouth. Now, the advantages are obvious. When everything funnels through one hub, rulers can provision chariot corps, commission monumental building, and keep skilled labor employed year-round. You want 1,000 spearheads in a hurry? A centralized workshop can ramp up production if the inputs are on hand. You want to standardize ship timbers? The palace can impose measurements and distribute the right wood to the right yard. Scale delivers spectacle and power. But scale has a shadow. Single points of failure multiply. If one harvest stumbles or a convoy with imported materials arrives late, the shortfall isn't confined to one village. It radiates through the entire schedule of promises the palace has already made. Imagine a line of dominoes labeled taxation, storage, rations, army, diplomacy. Nudge the first, say, a drought that trims yields by 10%, and the tip can travel a long way. What about incentives inside this machine? For elites, access to the storerooms is both salary and status. Loyalty is rewarded with allocations of land use, goods, or labor. That's efficient for the center, but it can blur the true cost of resources. If your workshop's allotment of copper is guaranteed by decree, why invest time in finding substitutes, improving efficiency, or building independent trade ties? For commoners on the edge, the calculus is harsher. A bad season can push a household into arrears. Without a cash market to smooth the shock, obligations may be worked off through corvée labor or, in some cases, forms of debt bondage. The ledgers balance. The people bend. Rations also shape behavior in subtle ways. When your daily bread and oil depend on the palace, it's rational to stay close to the palace. People cluster where the storerooms are, where the scribes count, where the guards protect. That concentration looks like prosperity until the flow slows. Then the same density becomes a queue, then a crowd, then a problem for the guards to manage. Centralization solves the distribution problem during normal times and turns it into a crowd control problem during scarcity. Let's talk about information. In a redistributive system, the most important price signal is not a price at all, it is a tally on a tablet, updated when shipments arrive or quotas are met. If the tablet says the warehouse holds 3 months of grain, officials plan accordingly. But what if spoilage is understated? What if a scribe copied last year's figure forward to make the numbers align? What if outlying villages delay deliveries because they're feeding themselves first? The palace may not see the shortfall until the wheels are already wobbling, and by then the only tools left are ration cuts, requisitions, or emergency levies, tools that keep the machine turning today at the cost of tomorrow's trust. None of this means the palaces were incompetent. On the contrary, they were brilliant at organizing complexity with the instruments they had. The question is resilience. When the plan matches reality, redistribution feels like civilization at its best, stored abundant, smoothed over time, craftspeople supported, armies fed, festivals held. When the plan drifts from reality, the very mechanisms that once ensured order can amplify stress. More audits, more quotas, more corvée, more promises on clay that can't be kept in grain. So as you picture those hushed archives and perfect stacks of amphorae, hold two truths at once. First, centralized redistribution created the scale that made this world glitter. Second, by tying so many livelihoods to a few storerooms and a few schedules, it increased the stakes of even small disruptions. A ledger can command a ration. It cannot conjure a harvest. And when the gap widens between what the tablet promises and what the storeroom holds, societies start making hard choices in a hurry. Let's talk metal, because in the late Bronze Age, metal isn't just stuff, it's structure. You can have all the talented artisans in the world, but without the right inputs, your workshop is a room full of frustrated experts. Bronze needs two ingredients, copper and tin. Copper is the extrovert of the pair, plentiful around Cyprus, shipped in those iconic oxide ingots stacked like flattened animal skins. Tin is the introvert, scarcer, more distant, and maddeningly essential. No tin, no bronze. No bronze, no spearheads, no chisels, no hinges, no elite tableware that tells everyone who's in charge. Cyprus, known as a lashir in the tablets, reliably throws its weight around with copper. We find the evidence in shipwrecks carrying tons of copper ingots, standardized for easy handling and accounting. But those same cargoes often include only a fraction as much tin by weight. Why? Because the tin has traveled farther, through more intermediaries, with more chances for a delay, a tax, or a theft. Scholars continue to debate precise sources, Anatolia, Central Asia, the Iranian plateau, but everyone agrees on the operational reality: tin is the choke point in the supply chain. Now imagine the system from the perspective of a palace quartermaster. Copper? Manageable. You can schedule convoys from Cyprus and negotiate predictable shipments. Tin? You're at the mercy of longer routes that cross multiple jurisdictions. Each handoff adds uncertainty, like a baton passing through a gauntlet. If any single segment falters, your whole production schedule goes sideways. This is what economists call a single critical input. If you lose timber, you can sometimes substitute different wood. If you lose grain, you might stretch with pulses or imports. If you lose tin, your bronze output drops, and with it your ability to equip armies and fulfill diplomatic gift expectations. This is also why so much trade is state-chartered or state-protected. Merchant houses thrive, but their profit often depends on palace favor, licenses, escorts, and access to harbors. Convoys sail on timetables that align with political calendars, treaty renewals, coronations, planting seasons, and campaigns. When the palace promises a shipment to an ally or needs a surge of weapon heads, it can requisition ship space and guards. That feels efficient from the center, until the center becomes the queue. If every palace in the region wants tin at the same time, the bottleneck tightens, and those with the strongest escorts or the sharpest elbows get first pick. Let's consider risk at sea. A single well-loaded merchantman doesn't just carry goods, it carries weeks of planned production. Lose that ship to a storm or a raid, and a workshop goes dark. The kill cools. Labor that was supposed to be paid in rations waits around or is reassigned to jobs with less strategic value. And because ledgers were written with those shipments assumed, the paper plan continues to look tidy a little longer than reality does. For a while you can triage, melt down old fittings, postpone civilian items, prioritize spearheads and sickles. But that is burning your furniture for warmth. It keeps you alive and leaves you with fewer assets tomorrow. Could palaces simply pay more silver by weight to attract tin? Sometimes, yes. But price isn't a magic wand when the physical flow is constrained by distance and politics. If a caravan is snowed in, or a frontier is blocked by conflict, or a middle broker is under pressure, there isn't a price that teleports the ingots to your pier. And when the same central authority that consumes the metal also regulates the trade, price signals can be slow or muted. You might not see the true scarcity until the backlog becomes impossible to hide. One more nuance. The symbolic role of bronze matters. It's not only utilitarian, it's prestige. Diplomatic gifts, ritual vessels, ceremonial weaponry, the kind of objects that grease high-level relationships, are bronze-rich. So when tin tightens, rulers face a delicate choice: feed the army's needs or feed the alliance's expectations. Skimp on the army, and you risk real security. Skimp on the gifts, and a partner might interpret it as disrespect or weakness. In a world where promise-keeping is currency, that's a costly signal. So the headline for this slide is simple and sharp. Copper is the brawn of the metal economy, tin is the brain stem. Disrupt copper, and the system limps. Disrupt tin, and the system blinks. The Late Bronze Age is a lesson in how a single, hard-to-substitute input can hold an entire civilization's toolset, and its diplomacy, by the throat. Slide 4 is about something we usually take for granted: how people keep score. Not in games, but in life. In the Late Bronze Age there are no coins. Value moves as silver by weight, as measured commodities, and as obligations recorded on tablets. That sounds abstract, so let's make it concrete. Picture a balanced scale on a table. Standardized weights in neat stacks. A scribe notes that a jar of oil is exchanged for so many shekels of silver by weight, or that a workshop owes the palace so many days of labor in return for last season's barley advance. Money here is partly metal, partly memory. Why does this matter? Because the form of money shapes the flow of information. With silver by weight, you can settle at a distance, but not with the instant, universal confidence of struck coin. Quality must be tested. Weights must be checked. Each transaction takes time, tools, trust. Meanwhile, a huge share of everyday exchange runs through accounting rather than spot cash. Palaces advance grain to villages, copper to artisans, and rations to rowers, then tally what is owed back later. Those tallies can smooth a bad season, but they also push stress into the future and into the ledger. Here is where signals get fuzzy. In a vibrant market with independent buyers and sellers, scarce goods tend to fetch higher prices quickly. That rising price is a flare gun: conserve, substitute, find new supply. In a redistributive system, the first signal is not a price but a number on a tablet. If the ration schedule says every worker gets a fixed allotment, the price of grain in that channel is temporarily insulated from reality. People are still fed on paper even if shipments are late. For a while, the center can maintain the illusion of normal by drawing down stores or redirecting supplies. The cost shows up later as a bigger deficit, tougher quotas, or arrears that have to be worked off. Let's look at credit. A palace that extends advances is part bank, part employer, part tax authority. That concentration has benefits. It can coordinate big projects and carry the community through a poor harvest. But it also creates moral hazard and dependence. If officials expect arrears to be forgiven with a holiday, their incentive to adjust early is weaker. If farmers expect an emergency ration regardless, their incentive to diversify away from palace crops is weaker. Nobody is acting irrationally, they're responding to the rules on the table. Rules that soften today's pain can make tomorrow's correction more abrupt. Silver by weight adds another wrinkle. It is a store of value, but its availability is uneven and its verification costly. In tight times, households may hoard small amounts, taking them out of circulation. The palace, short on easy silver, leans harder on in-kind requisitions and labor drafts. That shifts the burden toward those least able to hide their assets. Again, not a moral lecture, just mechanics. When measuring sticks are clunky and the biggest creditor is also the tax collector, adjustments tend to land on those nearest the storeroom door. You can also see how accounting can both clarify and conceal. A well-kept ledger is a triumph of administration. It tells you who owes what, where inventories stand, and how many rations are due next month. But ledgers are only as honest as the inputs. Spoilage might be understated to avoid punishment. A shipment promised on a tablet may be counted as good as delivered for planning purposes. And because the units are diverse, shekels of silver here, jars of oil there, days of corvée over here, it's easy for officials to believe balance has been achieved when, in reality, irreplaceable goods are dwindling. Now, pause on a human scene. Imagine a village headman after a poor harvest. He owes grain back for last year's advance. He also needs to feed his people and meet a labor levy. Does he default and risk sanctions, or does he strip next season's seed grain to stay square on the books? There's no villain in this picture, only incentives. The higher up the chain you go, the smoother the numbers look. The closer you get to the field, the harder the trade-offs feel. All of this is why, in this period, decrees sometimes appear announcing debt relief or arrears holidays. They act as pressure valves. They release tension and restore social peace. They also reset expectations that obligations can be renegotiated if enough pain accumulates. In the short run, that may be merciful. In the long run, it can make planning even harder. Lenders become more cautious. Borrowers delay hard choices, hoping for another decree. The signal is blurred again. One last thought for this slide. When money is partly metal and partly memory, trust is the critical technology. Trust in the weights and measures. Trust in the scribe's hand. Trust that an IOU written after sunset will still matter at sunrise. Lose that trust, and silver gets heavier, ledgers get longer, guards get busier. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Systems don't only run on goods, they run on signals. If the signals dim, even full storerooms can feel empty. Slide 5 is where the weather and the earth itself enter the story. But let's be careful. Climate and earthquakes are not cartoon villains that push over civilizations with one dramatic shove. They are stress multipliers. They expose weak joints. They force choices. And in a system that's tightly coupled, even modest stress can ripple farther than anyone expects. Start with the sky. Across parts of the eastern Mediterranean in the decades around 1200 before the Common Era, the proxy evidence points to drier conditions. Pollen records show shifts toward more drought-tolerant plants. Caves preserve dripstone layers that hint at less rainfall. None of this means the rain stopped entirely, or that every region suffered equally. It does mean that harvest variability increased just when storehouses and schedules were already stretched. A 10% shortfall in a household garden is an inconvenience. A 10% shortfall in a palace granary that feeds an army is a strategic problem. When rain falters, the first sign is subtle. Grain ships are a little later. Rations are trimmed a little. The palace asks villages to send a few more carts from their reserves to meet obligations. But remember how information flows here. Ledgers update more slowly than weather does. By the time the numbers acknowledge a pattern, the countryside has been adjusting for months. Families stretch flour with barley husks. Herds are culled earlier than planned. Seed grain is quietly eaten. The center sees a shortage. The periphery feels a squeeze. Now the ground. The eastern Mediterranean sits along busy fault systems, and archaeological layers from the Aegean and Anatolia show clusters of buildings collapsed in ways consistent with shaking. Some scholars describe this as an earthquake storm, a period when several significant quakes happened within a human lifetime. Whether or not that label is perfect, the pattern matters. Walls crack. Granaries fail. Harbors silt up. Temples lose their roofs. Even if a city survives, the labor and materials diverted to repairs show up as opportunity costs in the ledger: fewer hands for harvest, fewer oxen for transport, fewer timbers for ships. Think about what happens when these stresses overlap. A dry year leaves granaries light. A tremor collapses a storehouse wall, spilling part of what remains. The palace orders emergency repairs and emergency requisitions. The requisitions pull carts and animals into service just as fields need tending. That's not a disaster narrative, it's a scheduling conflict with teeth. Every solution steals time or goods from something else on the calendar. There's a human rhythm to this, too. In a good year, communities repay advances and rebuild their buffers. In a string of thin years, they lean on credit and hope for a rebound. If quakes or storms damage roads and piers, the imports that would have smoothed the shock arrive too late or not at all. A system designed to iron out short-term bumps with redistribution is suddenly ironing over long-term grooves. From the center, that looks like competence. From the edge, it feels like depletion. Notice the incentives that drift in under the weather. If you're an official responsible for quotas during a dry spell, do you report shortfalls early and risk punishment, or do you roll the dice that next season will fix the numbers? If you're a village headman and an earthquake has damaged your storage jars, do you admit the loss and beg for a ration, or do you try to meet the levy and keep your reputation intact? These are not signs of corruption so much as signs of a system straining to hold its shape. When the environment squeezes, people tighten their grip on whatever they still control. And yet, climate and quakes do not dictate outcomes. They set the stage. What matters is how institutions translate shocks into choices. In a world where redundancy is expensive, where critical inputs travel long distances, and where ledgers promise more stability than the weather can deliver, even small environmental nudges can tilt the balance. A dry decade is survivable with slack, transparency, and adaptation. It is dangerous when slack is thin, information is slow, and adaptation is bounded by decree. So as we leave this slide, hold this thought. Nature doesn't care about schedules, quotas, or rituals. It nudges and knocks. Societies that can bend. Societies that are locked into a plan try to bend the facts to fit the plan. That works, until it doesn't. War is rarely just battles, it is logistics with blood pressure. On this slide we enter the era when conflict, migration, and raids start tugging on the same threads that hold everything else together. The texts from Egypt talk about confederations of seaborne raiders. Coastal cities record attacks and hurried pleas for help. Whether every name on those lists represents a single people or a loose label, the pattern is clear. The coastline gets noisy, convoys get nervous, and palaces that once exported confidence now import anxiety. Let's start with the military budget problem. When threats rise, rulers mobilize. Chariots need bronze fittings and trained horses. Infantry need spearheads and rations. Forts need repairs. All of that draws directly from the same storerooms that feed artisans and shipwrights. In stable years, this is manageable, warfare is seasonal and predictable. In unstable years, the calendar collapses. A harvest delayed by drought overlaps with a campaign brought forward by raids. Suddenly, the workers who were supposed to thresh grain are marching, and the carts that were supposed to move timber are hauling javelins. Convoys are the arteries of this world, and war acts like a clamp. Merchant ships now sail with heavier escorts, fewer stops, and tighter schedules. That sounds safer, but it concentrates risk. If you bunch ships together behind a guard, one storm or one ambush threatens more cargo at once. If you skip smaller ports to reduce exposure, you also reduce the number of places where local communities can top up supplies. Overland, caravans reroute to avoid contested passes, adding days and new tolls. Every detour stacks pressure onto the ledgers back home. Then there's the labor problem. Armies eat. They also absorb manpower precisely when fields and workshops need it most. Drafts expand, mercenaries are hired, and garrisons swell. But mercenaries are a delicate instrument. When rations are short or pay is late, loyalty flows to the highest bidder, or to whoever can feed a family tonight. That's not treachery, that's arithmetic. Palaces respond by tightening control, auditing stores, and requisitioning goods directly. The more they centralize to meet the emergency, the more they crowd out the flexible, informal trade that could have absorbed shocks. On the coast, raids do more than steal cargo. They change behavior. Fishermen risk fewer trips. Pilots hug the shoreline and wait for better weather, which means cargoes arrive bunched and late. Port officials who once stamped manifests now juggle triage, which grain gets unloaded first, which bronze ingots are escorted inland, which refugees get housed inside the walls. Yes, refugees. Conflict displaces people, and people move with urgent needs. A town that planned to ration for 10,000 mouths suddenly has 12,000. The math doesn't care that the newcomers are innocent, the storeroom shelves just get emptier faster. Diplomacy enters as both lubricant and sand in the gears. Gift exchanges and treaty renewals require symbolic goods, fine bronze vessels, decorated weapons, rare textiles. Those are precisely the items endangered by tin shortages and disrupted workshops. Cut the gifts, and partners feel snubbed. Keep the gifts flowing, and the army notices its spearheads arriving late. Either choice communicates something, and in a tense neighborhood, signals matter. A weak gift package can embolden a rival as effectively as a poorly guarded border. We should also talk about information fog. In wartime, good news travels fast and is exaggerated. Bad news travels slowly and is punished. Officials fear reporting lost shipments or failed levies. Villages hide grain to hedge against the unknown. The center responds with more inspections and tighter controls. In the short run, that can squeeze out a few more months of apparent order. In the long run, it clogs the very channels, trust, initiative, local trade, that keep complex societies nimble. Put it all together and the mechanism looks like this. Conflict lifts demand for metals and food at the exact moment supply is hardest to move. Migration and raids add mouths and reduce confidence. Palaces, facing simultaneous military and fiscal pressure, pull every lever at once: drafts, requisitions, audits, and decrees. Those levers work, briefly, by transferring risk from the center to the periphery. Then the periphery thins out, and there is less left to transfer. The point isn't that war caused the collapse by itself. The point is that war tightened every other constraint. It made tin scarcer, ledgers rosier than reality, and promises harder to keep. In a world where the system runs hot even in peace, sustained conflict pushes it past the red line. Slide 7 is a close-up, and it reads like a countdown. The city is Ugarit, a bustling port on the Syrian coast, where scribes wrote in both Akkadian and Ugaritic, where warehouses sat just a short cart ride from the sea, and where the palace managed promises with a precision that looks almost modern. We don't have to guess what went wrong here, the tablets tell us. Start with the tone of the letters. They are not philosophical. They are practical, impatient, and increasingly frantic. Requests for grain become pleas. Shipments that were assumed become questions. Officials write to counterparts inland and along the coast asking for emergency consignments, for troops, for escorts. One message warns that enemy ships have been sighted. Another notes that the granaries are low. The verbs shorten, the courtesies thin. You can hear the administrative voice drop an octave from ceremonial to survival. Now picture the sequence on the ground. The palace has contracts outstanding. Bronze is owed to one ally, timber promised to another. A convoy that should have arrived last month is late, so workshop masters begin to reshuffle. Civilian work gets deferred while military fittings receive priority. Old metal is pulled from chests and melted down to keep the most urgent orders alive. Scribes, doing their jobs faithfully, record it all. They recognize credits for cargoes in transit. They extend the due date on a village's grain because of failed rains. They enter arrears but note that relief is expected. The ledger stays balanced in ink a little longer than it stays balanced in reality. This is where the phrase paper promises outliving real inventories earns its keep. The tablets preserve obligations with perfect memory. The storerooms do not. Spoilage takes its quiet share. Pilfering takes a smaller but real slice. A wall repair consumes timber that someone thought was reserved for shipbuilding. By the time a senior official asks the storeroom clerk for a full count, the difference between the written number and the stacked jars is not a rounding error. It is a policy problem. The letters also reveal social stress rising through the layers. When rations thin, the calculus for everyone changes. Elite households that once received generous allocations send trusted servants to queue earlier at the magazines. Workshop foremen tighten discipline to discourage theft and absenteeism. Commoners, already carrying the weight of levies and drafts, make quieter choices: a hidden jar of barley under a floor, a decision to keep back a cart for family use instead of palace hauling, a son sent to a cousin inland where there might still be work. None of this makes headlines. It makes consequences. There is a chilling detail in Ugarit's archive. Some tablets were still unfired when the city fell, their clay hardened only by the fire that destroyed the buildings. That tells us the administration was working until the end, trying to coordinate defense and supply even as risk climbed the stairs. A scribe pressed a stylus into wet clay to register the arrival of troops or the dispatch of a messenger. Then, before the document could join the shelves in an orderly stack, the shelf and the office and the scribe's whole world were overrun. The fire that bakes the evidence also writes the final punctuation mark. We should resist the temptation to frame this as incompetence. The letters show foresight and effort. Requests go out for grain from inland allies, for archers, for ships to escort vulnerable cargo. The system is doing what it was built to do: coordinate, redistribute, and call in favors. But as shortages deepen and threats multiply, the coordination tools produce diminishing returns. Each new order cannibalizes resources meant for another order. Each extension of credit pushes pressure forward a few more weeks. Precision administration buys time. It cannot mint grain that never grew or conjure tin from a closed pass. If you want a single image to carry from this slide, imagine two stacks. On one table, tablets piled neatly, each a promise, each a plan, each a record of what should be. On the other table, jars and sacks and ingots stacked imperfectly, each a reality check. For years the two stacks matched closely enough. Then the gap widened quietly, and then suddenly. Ugarit's letters are the story of that widening gap, written in the moment before the last line went down. On this slide we stop naming events and start tracing the mechanism. Think of the late Bronze Age system as a finely tuned machine running near redline. When one gear slips, friction spreads. For dynamics matter most: supply chain fragility, information failure, perverse incentives, and the rising costs of complexity. Begin with supply chain fragility. Tin is the classic single point of failure, but the structure is general. Long routes, few substitutes, tight schedules. When a convoy is delayed, the palace triages: weapons before plowshares, garrisons before gifts, short-term security before maintenance. That buys a month, not a model. Each triage decision leaves a small crater somewhere else in the economy. Skip ship repairs now, face a breakdown later. Melt temple fittings now, lose diplomatic capital later. Fragility hides in those trade-offs because the cost lands in the future and in a different department. Now information failure. In a market with many independent buyers and sellers, price moves early and loudly. In a redistributive system, the first signal is an allocation table. If rations are fixed by decree, scarcity looks like the same number of jars issued to more anxious faces. On paper, stability holds. In reality, queues lengthen, side deals multiply, and officials discover shortfalls late, after options have narrowed. When the numbers finally change, they change abruptly: ration cuts, new levies, emergency decrees, because gradualism was postponed by optimism and by fear of admitting stress. Perverse incentives take their place once stress is chronic. If a workshop's copper allotment is guaranteed, why risk experimenting with new alloys or techniques that might be punished if they fail? If arrears have been forgiven before, why declare trouble early and take the reputational hit? If promotion depends on tidy ledgers, what happens to the scribe who records spoilage accurately during a tense season? People aren't villains in this story. They are rational under the rules they're given. But when rules reward appearance over adaptation, the system gets brittle even as the paperwork looks more perfect. Finally, complexity costs. As problems compound, the state's reflex is to add layers: more inspectors to check storerooms, more officials to route convoys, more scribes to reconcile conflicting tallies, more guards to prevent pilfering. Each layer consumes resources and time. Each adds friction to the very channels that need to be nimble. Joseph Tainter's basic insight is visible here without any jargon. Beyond a certain point, each additional unit of complexity returns less benefit and requires more upkeep. In a benign environment, you can carry that overhead. In a stressed environment, overhead is the weight that keeps the cart from clearing the mud. Put these dynamics together and a causal loop emerges. Shortage in a critical input triggers triage. Triage creates deferred maintenance and social strain. Strain prompts tighter control. Tighter control slows information and crowds out local initiative. Slower information and less initiative deepen the shortage. To the people inside the machine, the response feels sensible at every step: prioritize the army, audit the stores, punish theft, hold the line on rations. From outside, you see a flywheel spinning: more control begets more brittleness, which begets more control. There is a moral texture to this mechanism, but it isn't an accusation. Centralized scale can build roads, armies, and temples. It can also concentrate risk. When signals dim and discretion shrinks, officials do what they know how to do: command harder. Households do what they must: hedge privately. Those two survival strategies are not enemies in intent, but they tug in opposite directions. The more energy the center spends forcing the plan to fit reality, the less slack remains for reality to surprise you without breaking you. If you want a single image for this slide, picture a beautifully engineered water network feeding a city. Add a drought that lowers the reservoir. The first response is rational: tighten valves, meter usage, police leaks. But the smaller the margin, the more every valve turn and every leak patrol costs. Eventually the energy spent on control reduces the very flow you are trying to preserve. That is how systems unravel, not with one dramatic failure, but with 1,000 reasonable adjustments that, together, dry the pipes. Picture the map after the great houses dim their lights. Cities shrink or go quiet. Trade corridors thin into paths. And yet, life doesn't stop, it rearranges. In the aftermath, we see a long drift from palaces toward villages, from hub-and-spoke distribution to webs of local production, and a gradual technological pivot that lowers the old bottlenecks. Start with settlement. Excavations show contraction in many urban centers and growth in smaller sites. Think of families choosing resilience over grandeur, closer to fields, closer to water, fewer steps between producer and eater. Without palatial rations as a safety net, communities diversify. Households plant mixed crops to spread risk. Local workshops refurbish tools, repair pottery, and trade in short hops rather than long, state-chartered leaps. This is not a golden age, but it is an age of learning by doing, one village at a time. Now the metal story. Iron begins to matter more, not because it is automatically superior for every purpose, but because the supply chain for it is different. Bronze requires copper and tin is scarce and far. Iron requires all that is more widely distributed and fuel for smelting that can be sourced locally, though with skill and labor. Early iron is not the steel of later centuries, it can be inconsistent, soft, even frustrating. But each furnace season teaches Smith something new. Each incremental improvement reduces dependence on the tin roots that once held entire economies by the throat. The result is not an overnight revolution, it is a slow, stubborn workaround that accumulates. Institutions change with the tools. When palaces can no longer smooth shocks with giant storehouses and convoys, other forms of coordination gain weight. Kin networks and village councils arbitrate disputes and pool labor at harvest. Merchant groups, modest at first, emerge to manage risk over short distances, moving salt, grain, and simple iron goods between markets a day or two apart. Where temples remain, they often act as trusted nodes, storing pledges, hosting fairs, and lending their credibility to private deals. None of this is glossy, but it is supple. It bends without breaking because the stakes of any single exchange are smaller, and the information is closer to the ground. This is also a period when social memory resets. People remember the promise and the peril of centralized abundance. They remember rations and requisitions, audits and queues, and the shock of watching those systems seize up. That memory nudges experimentation. Property customs evolve to clarify who can plant where and who can claim the yield. Simple contracts appear for seasonal labor and sharecropping. Standard measures creep back in, one market at a time, because traders are tired of arguing over volume and weight. Far in the future, coinage will crystallize these experiments into metal that speaks a shared language. But in this era, the work is quieter, habits becoming norms, norms becoming rules. A word on prosperity. From a distance, this looks like decline, and in many respects it is: fewer grand monuments, fewer far-flung luxury goods, fewer carved records of kings. But there is another ledger to read, the one not inscribed on stone. Households hedge risk with mixed subsistence rather than waiting for ration tablets. Smiths master a new material that can be sourced without crossing for borders. Trade routes are shorter and less hostage to palace calendars. The margin for error widens a little because the system is less tightly coupled and more forgiving of local adjustments. None of this romanticizes village life. It is hard, contingent, and often precarious. Famines still happen. Violence still visits. But the mechanics of survival look different. When a shipment is late, a village that depends mostly on itself is annoyed, a palace that depends on a convoy is endangered. Over many seasons, modest, decentralized choices accumulate into cultural muscle memory, diversify inputs, keep buffers close, let price and reputation do more of the signaling work, and do not bet the harvest on promises written far away. If the earlier slide showed how complex centralization can fail gracefully for years and then suddenly, this slide shows how modest decentralization can recover clumsily at first and then sturdily. Iron tools that start out crude become reliable. Local norms that start out ad hoc become predictable. Small markets that start out thin become lively. The grand lights dimmed, many smaller lamps were lit. We've walked the corridors, read the tablets, and watched the gears slip. Now, let's turn the camera around and study the machine itself. What did the Bronze Age teach us about how complex societies actually work when the lights flicker? First, scale is powerful, but scale is costly. Centralized palaces could marshal armies, standardize ships, and feed specialists who made wonders. But the bill for that coordination came due when inputs tightened and information moved slower than the weather. A system that shines in calm seas can list in a light swell if its margins are too thin. Second, the form of money matters because it is the language of signals. Silver by weight and ledgered rations kept people cooperating, until the signals blurred. When the price of scarcity is translated into quota tables and emergency decrees, adjustments happen late and all at once. That's not a morality tale, it's a physics lesson about feedback. Third, incentives are the quiet architects of outcomes. Guarantees from the storehouse rewarded loyalty and stability, but they also dulled the edge of adaptation. If your copper allotment arrives by decree, experimentation feels dangerous. If arrears relief arrives by decree, early warnings feel foolish. Everyone followed the rules steered the ship. Fourth, complexity buys capability until it buys drag. Every new inspector, every extra scribe, every additional checkpoint was meant to protect the system. In stress, those layers turned into friction, slowing trade, muffling information, and making small workarounds harder to attempt. Complexity is not the enemy, but it does demand fuel, and famine is a poor time to stoke the boiler. So where does resilience come from? From slack you can actually touch. From redundancy you do not have to ask permission to use. From signals that arrive fast and can be believed without a guard at the scale. In the aftermath, villages nudged toward those traits: shorter routes, mixed crops, local repair, and, slowly, a technology that did not kneel before a single faraway input. None of it was glamorous. Much of it worked. And here are the questions I want to leave you with. When do promises on tablets outrun the jars on the floor, and who notices first? How much control can a center exert before it begins to squeeze out the very initiative that would help it? Are we willing to trade a little spectacle for a little slack? And when a system has to choose between feeding soldiers and keeping faith with allies, what signal travels farthest and lasts longest? The Bronze Age collapse is not simply an ending. It is a seminar in cause and effect. It shows how wars tighten supply lines, how climate tests buffers, how ledgers can comfort and mislead, and how ordinary households carry extraordinary weight. It also shows that recovery often begins small, with a furnace that burns a bit hotter, a market that weighs a bit fairer, and a village that stores a bit wiser. If this exploration challenged how you think about ancient power, and maybe modern systems too, stick with us. If you enjoyed this episode, like the video, drop a comment with the question you're still thinking about, and subscribe for more deep dives. And if you want to keep going beyond the episode, check out my book History They Tried to Erase, in the description. If thoughtful, entertaining history is your thing, you'll find plenty more to explore here on Truth Behind History.